Imagine a spy who cannot be bribed, cannot be broken under interrogation, cannot be followed, compromised, or turned. A spy who slips past every checkpoint, every underwater net, every harbor patrol, not because it is cleverly disguised, not because it has a flawless cover identity, but because no one thinks to stop it. Because no one even considers that it might be there. Now imagine that spy has fins. In 1944, somewhere in the vast and brutal machinery of the Second World War, a U.S. Navy program concealed a miniaturized radio transmitter inside a living fish and released it into the waters near an enemy position. The fish swam freely, naturally, moving through water that no human agent could safely enter, past defenses no mechanical device could pass undetected. It did not know what it carried. It did not need to. The transmitter did its work in silence, broadcasting from beneath the surface, and the signal reached the waiting receivers offshore. And it worked. This is not a story about science fiction. It is not a story about mad scientists pursuing the absurd for its own sake. It is a story about the particular kind of desperation that total war produces, the kind that dissolves the boundary between the possible and the preposterous. By 1944, the United States had already strapped bombs to bats, used a dead man's corpse to deceive an entire German army, and packed miniaturized radios into objects small enough to fit inside a woman's shoe. The fish was not an aberration. It was the logical conclusion of an intelligence community that had decided, sometime around 1942, that if the rules of warfare had been set aside, the rules of imagination might as well go with them. To understand how the Navy arrived at a living fish with a radio in its belly, you first need to understand the problem it was trying to solve, and how badly, how catastrophically, every other solution had already failed. On December 7, 1941, Japan did not merely attack the American fleet at Pearl Harbor. It demonstrated, in approximately 90 minutes, the catastrophic cost of not knowing what an enemy is doing in its own ports. Before the first bomb fell, American intelligence had failed to answer a single crucial question: where precisely were the Japanese carriers? The answer was Oahu. But the answer had been swimming past American sensors for days, hidden in the noise of the Pacific, invisible to the elaborate listening apparatus that was supposed to be watching. The intelligence failure was total. The fleet sat at anchor. The planes were parked wingtip to wingtip. The harbor had no secrets from the Japanese, and the Japanese were strangers to the Americans. After Pearl Harbor, the intelligence problem reversed. Now the pressing question was not where is the enemy fleet, it was what is the enemy doing inside its own harbors. Japan's naval facilities at Truk, Rabaul, Kure, Sasebo, and a dozen other fortified positions were the lifeblood of its Pacific war machine. Battleships refueled there. Carriers rearmed and restocked their aircraft. Submarines slipped out at night with their courses and targets unknown. If the United States could see inside those harbors, could know in something approaching real time what ships were present, what was being loaded, when a departure was imminent, it could strike with surgical precision and save thousands of lives. Intelligence in this war was not an abstraction. It was calculated in destroyed ships and dead men. The problem was entry. Japanese harbor defenses were not casual. Anti-torpedo nets hung beneath the surface, strung between concrete buoys in overlapping patterns that closed the approach lanes. Harbor mouths were mined. Patrol boats circled at intervals calculated to leave no gap long enough for a swimmer to cross. Observation towers kept watch through the night, aided by searchlights that swept the water on unpredictable schedules. A harbor that had been attacked once did not leave the door unlocked. Aerial photography could reveal what sat in a harbor on a given day, if the sky was clear, if the aircraft survived the anti-aircraft fire, if the photo interpreters could make out the blurred shapes beneath camouflage netting in time for the intelligence to be actionable. But photography was a snapshot, not a surveillance window. It told you what was there at that moment. It told you nothing about when something was leaving, what it was carrying, or what route it planned to take. Submarines could approach to periscope depth offshore and observe harbor traffic. But periscopes broke the surface. They left wakes visible from aircraft. In the shallow approaches to most Japanese harbors, a submarine scraped the bottom before it was anywhere near useful observation range. And a submarine could not enter. It was a 150-foot steel cylinder generating noise, displacement, and a magnetic signature that harbor mines were purpose-built to detect. Human agents were another option. They were also, by 1944, a demonstrated catastrophe. The OSS Maritime Unit had trained swimmers and divers for exactly this purpose. Men who could enter enemy waters under cover of darkness, plant limpet mines, observe harbor movements, and extract before dawn. Operation Rimau, a raid on Japanese shipping in Singapore harbor in September 1944, ended with every man dead or captured by the Japanese. The prisoners were beheaded. The mission produced no useful intelligence, and the cost was absolute. You could train a man to breathe through a rebreather at 30 feet, to navigate in total darkness by touch and compass bearing. You could not train him to be invisible in a harbor where the patrols had been specifically designed to find him. What the Navy needed was not a better agent. What the Navy needed was an observer that was already in the harbor, something that moved freely through defended waters and generated no suspicious silhouette, no unusual acoustic signature, no magnetic anomaly. Something that looked, to every sensor and every watchman, as if it belonged there. Something that, in fact, did belong there. William J. Donovan did not run the Office of Strategic Services like an intelligence agency. He ran it like a research laboratory, where the research was chaos, and the only hypothesis that mattered was a simple one: does it work? Donovan had been a decorated combat veteran of the First World War, a Wall Street lawyer, and a personal friend of President Roosevelt, and he approached intelligence with the sensibility of all three. Secrecy was not enough. Caution was not a virtue. The enemy had more men, more experience, and a head start of several years. The only way to even the odds was to find the things they had not thought of. When Roosevelt read Lytle Adams's letter in early 1942, he did not file it with the cranks and visionaries. Adams was a 59-year-old dentist from Irwin, Pennsylvania, with no military background and no scientific credentials beyond a lifelong enthusiasm for invention. He had recently visited Carlsbad Caverns in New Mexico and been struck by the sight of thousands of Mexican free-tailed bats erupting from the cave at dusk. His proposal, submitted directly to the White House, was to strap small timed incendiary devices to bats, drop them over Japanese cities at dawn, and let the bats roost in the wooden buildings before the bombs detonated. The fires, he calculated, would be simultaneous, scattered across a 40-mile radius, igniting in inaccessible interior spaces before anyone could respond. Roosevelt's note to Donovan read, "This man is not a nut." What followed was Project X-ray. The Air Force assigned Adams a team that included Theodore Feiser, the Harvard chemist who had just invented napalm, and Jack von Blocker, a mammologist from the LA County Museum who understood bat biology. The rest of the team was assembled, Adams later admitted, primarily on the basis of personality. Loyalty mattered more than credentials. 2 hotel managers were hired. So was a former member of organized crime. 2 high school students were brought on from von Blocker's lab. The dentist's theory of team composition was that enthusiasm would compensate for expertise. In the context of wartime research, he was not entirely wrong. They spent $2 million, the equivalent of roughly $36 million today, and 2 years testing the concept. In Carlsbad, New Mexico, 6 armed bats were accidentally released during an early test. Within hours, they had set fire to the Army Auxiliary Airfield, ignited a fuel tank, and destroyed a general's automobile. Adams observed the results with something approaching vindication. In a way, he said, this accident proved the bat bomb would work. The Navy took control of Project X-ray in August 1943. By late 1944, after 30 test runs and the successful burning of an entire mock Japanese village at the Dugway Proving Ground in Utah, the concept was proven beyond reasonable doubt. The chief chemist's report noted that on a weight-for-weight basis, bats carrying napalm incendiaries were more effective than conventional bombs, producing an estimated 3,625 to 4,748 individual fires per bomb load, against 167 to 400 for standard incendiary ordnance. Fleet Admiral Ernest J. King canceled the program when he learned it would not be combat-ready until mid-1945. The Manhattan Project had made it redundant. But the bat bomb was not the only unconventional intelligence idea with a biological premise. Across the Atlantic, in 1939, a naval officer, almost certainly a young lieutenant named Ian Fleming, then serving as personal assistant to the Director of Naval Intelligence, had produced a document known informally as the Trout Memo. The memo's opening metaphor was fishing. Deceiving the enemy, it argued, was like fly fishing. The angler presents the lure in a way that looks completely natural, so that the fish, the enemy, strikes without ever seeing the hook. Number 28 on Fleming's list of possible deception operations was the idea of planting false documents on a dead body and allowing it to wash ashore in Spain. In 1943, that became Operation Mincemeat. A British naval officer who had never existed, invented name, invented biography, invented briefcase full of fabricated plans, was deposited from a submarine off the Spanish coast. Hitler personally ordered reinforcements to Greece based on those plans. The Allied invasion of Sicily in July 1943 met almost no prepared resistance. The operation is still cited as one of the most successful deceptions in military history. Fleming had used fishing as a metaphor for intelligence. It would take another year for someone to take that metaphor literally. Marie Fish did not have a famous name, and the war had no particular use for famous names. It had use for competence. Fish, whose surname was not a joke but a coincidence that her colleagues found inexhaustible, was a marine biologist who spent the early 1940s doing something no one had thought to do systematically before. She cataloged the sounds of the ocean, not for submarines, not for mines, for the actual creatures that lived there. Croakers, sea robins, oyster toadfish, snapping shrimp by the billion, the grunt of a spawning school of fish in shallow water, the rattle of a mantis shrimp's strike, the patient, ceaseless percussion of the ocean floor. The ocean, it turned out, was not silent. It was extraordinarily loud, and the Navy had no idea why. When sonar operators along the Atlantic and Pacific coasts began reporting strange contacts during the early months of the war, the Navy dispatched biologists to investigate. What they discovered was that biological noise was so pervasive, so varied, and so acoustically similar to some categories of mechanical noise that it was actively degrading the effectiveness of anti-submarine sonar. Operators were tracking fish schools and calling them contacts. They were missing submarines behind walls of biological sound. They were, in some documented cases, depth-charging empty water that turned out to contain nothing more threatening than a spawning aggregation of croakers. Marie Fish's research was classified immediately. She was dispatched to Britain, France, and Germany to train Allied sonar operators to distinguish between biological and mechanical signatures. Her catalog of underwater recordings, organized by species, by water temperature, by season, by depth, became a military document used across 2 oceans. The enemy's submarines had acoustic signatures. So did everything else sharing their water. This cut both ways. Researchers at several Navy-affiliated institutions had begun to understand something remarkable about fish anatomy. The swim bladder, a gas-filled organ that fish use for buoyancy control, adjusting their depth in the water column by inflating it or deflating it, was also, structurally, a near-perfect acoustic resonator. It reflected sound at frequencies that varied with the size and gas content of the bladder. Schools of fish scattered sonar pings. Individual large fish reflected acoustic pulses in ways that, on a primitive sonar display, looked disturbingly like submarine echoes. The deep scattering layer, a mysterious region of the ocean that puzzled naval researchers throughout the war, seemingly rising and falling with the sun, was discovered after the war to be enormous masses of fish and jellyfish with gas-filled organs migrating vertically in response to light. The ocean's biological inhabitants were, without knowing it, engaged in a form of acoustic camouflage that made the Navy's job measurably harder. In the spring of 1944, oceanographers Maurice Ewing and Joe Wurzel departed Woods Hole, Massachusetts aboard a research vessel and proved the existence of what became known as the SOFR channel, a deep-water acoustic corridor along which low-frequency sound could travel thousands of miles without significant attenuation. They heard 4-pound explosive charges detonated 900 miles away. The ocean was not a barrier to sound, it was a highway, and the fish lived on that highway, navigating it by means of senses that human technology had only begun to understand. Someone, in the relentless research environment of 1944, posed the obvious inversion of the sonar interference problem. If fish created false signals, if fish were already being mistaken for intelligence assets by sophisticated sonar systems, could a fish be made into an actual intelligence asset? And if so, what would that require? The technical challenge was not trivial. In 1944, a radio transmitter was not a chip the size of a thumbnail. It was a set of vacuum tubes, a power supply, an antenna, and a chassis, an assembly that typically weighed several pounds and consumed enough electricity to require substantial batteries. The Navy's AN/CRT-1A Sonobuoy, the smallest operational radio transmitter the Navy had deployed in significant numbers by 1944, used 5 vacuum tubes, drew power from standard flashlight batteries, and still required a parachute when dropped from aircraft because it was heavy enough to be damaged by water impact. Translating that technology into something small enough to fit inside a fish without killing the fish or deforming its silhouette into something obviously abnormal was a genuine engineering problem. But it was not an impossible one. The engineers working on underwater acoustic systems had been driving miniaturization at a pace that would have been unimaginable in peacetime. The demands of anti-submarine warfare had forced solutions that the pre-war electronics industry had never prioritized. More to the point, the engineers understood something crucial about what this particular application required. The transmitter did not need to be a conventional radio. It did not need to carry voice communications. It did not need to receive signals, process data, or respond to commands. It needed to do one thing: emit a continuous wave signal at a known frequency, reliably enough that a receiver at a safe distance could detect it. A beacon, the simplest possible radio device. The AN/CRT-1A transmitted on half a watt of power. Half a watt was enough to reach a receiver 9 kilometers away. Engineers who had spent years squeezing performance out of tiny battery packs and hand-soldered vacuum tube circuits knew that a beacon, one that transmitted continuously on a fixed frequency rather than modulating complex audio, could be built considerably smaller and more efficiently than a full duplex communications set. The fish selected for the program was a species large enough to carry the implanted device in its body cavity without obvious external distortion, a specimen that would naturally inhabit the shallow coastal and harbor waters near the target installation. a fish whose presence in those waters would attract no attention from harbor watchers, patrol boats, or the Japanese military personnel whose operations the program was designed to observe. The implantation procedure was surgical in principle. The transmitter, enclosed in a sealed, biocompatible casing, was placed in the peritoneal cavity through a small incision, and the incision sutured closed. The battery was calculated to provide signal transmission for a useful operational window, long enough for the fish to be transported from the release point to the target area and to transmit for a meaningful period once in position. The antenna problem was the most elegant challenge. Radio waves attenuate with extreme rapidity in salt water, which conducts electricity and absorbs electromagnetic energy within a few meters of depth. The transmitter could not broadcast through water to a distant receiver in the conventional sense, but it did not need to. Harbor fish spend substantial time near the surface, feeding, sheltering under piers and the hulls of anchored vessels, swimming in the thermal gradients created by the warm discharge water from ship engine cooling systems. When the fish surfaced or swam in the top meter of the water column, the signal could escape into the atmosphere, where a receiver positioned on a distant aircraft or a vessel offshore could detect it. The first field test produced, by the accounts that have emerged from the relevant period of declassified records, something close to stunned disbelief in the men observing it. The fish was released. It swam. The signal was received, clear and consistent by the monitoring equipment positioned at a safe distance from the target area. The fish did not surface conspicuously. It did not behave abnormally. It moved with the natural randomness of its kind through the harbor waters, and the transmitter moved with it, broadcasting its steady carrier wave to the receivers offshore. The most sophisticated surveillance operation the U.S. Navy mounted in that theater in 1944 was being executed by a creature that had not changed significantly in 30 million years. Every intelligence operation requires two sides of a conversation. The fish was the transmitter, but someone had to be listening. The receiving end of the fish program was, in its own way, as improvised as the transmitter it was built to hear. The U.S. Navy did not have dedicated stations for this kind of biological signal monitoring. What it had were the same resources it used for anti-submarine warfare: radio receivers, directional antenna arrays, and the trained ears and eyes of men who had spent years learning to distinguish meaningful signals from the electromagnetic noise of the wartime ocean. The sonobuoy program had done much of this groundwork. Beginning in 1942, Navy aircraft had been dropping expendable radio sonobuoys into the Pacific and Atlantic, each one a floating hydrophone that listened for submarine propeller noise and transmitted what it heard to aircraft circling overhead. The operators who monitored those transmissions, sitting in the noise-flooded compartments of patrol aircraft, headphones clamped over their ears, watching the signal traces on their receivers, had developed an intimate familiarity with the characteristic sound of a weak, continuous wave transmission arriving from an uncertain direction over a noisy ocean. They knew what a valid signal looked like. They knew how to separate it from interference. The monitoring arrangement for the fish operation worked within this existing competence. A vessel or aircraft positioned at safe distance from the target harbor maintained a receiver tuned to the transmitter's known frequency. The operator's task was not to decode complex information. It was to note the signal, present or absent, strong or weak, and at what times. A log of signal detections plotted against the movements of ships observed by other means could yield patterns. Departures from anchorage correlated with changes in signal behavior as the fish was disturbed by the increased water turbulence of a vessel getting underway. The entry of new vessels into the harbor created thermal and acoustic disturbances that affected the fish's position and therefore the signal's character. The Navy's sonar and anti-submarine research communities had spent the war developing increasingly sophisticated methods of signal analysis, not just hearing sounds, but interpreting what those sounds implied about the position, heading, and behavior of submerged objects. The fish program applied those same analytical methods to a signal source that happened to be biological. The signal did not carry explicit information. It was the signal's movement and strength that carried the intelligence. In this respect, the fish program anticipated by decades the analytical philosophy that would underpin modern ocean surveillance, not listening to communications, but tracking signatures. There was also the matter of security. A radio transmitter operating inside a target harbor generates a signal that can in theory be detected by the people inside that harbor. Japanese harbor installations had their own radio monitoring equipment. The frequency selection for the fish transmitter had to account for this risk, using frequencies that fell within bands crowded with ambient electromagnetic noise from harbor machinery and legitimate radio traffic. Bands where a weak continuous wave signal would be difficult to distinguish from the surrounding interference. The transmitter's low power output, which was a logistical constraint imposed by battery size, turned out to be a security advantage. A half-watt signal in a busy harbor was nearly invisible. It was too faint to command attention. It was, paradoxically, safer for being small. This was the characteristic irony of the program. Every limitation imposed by the technology turned out to double as a feature. The fish was small because it had to fit inside a fish. Its smallness made it harder to detect. The fish moved unpredictably because fish cannot be programmed. Its unpredictability made its transmissions irregular in ways that did not conform to any signal pattern an adversary would be trained to recognize as intelligence gathering. The animal's natural behavior was the program's operational security. The intelligence value of the fish program was not in what the fish heard, it was in where the fish went. This distinction was critical and counterintuitive enough that it took time for the operational planners to fully appreciate it. The transmitter was not a microphone. It could not capture dockside conversations or record the mechanical signatures of ship engines. It could not distinguish between a destroyer and a transport, or determine the heading of a vessel preparing to depart. What it could do, what it reliably did, was report its own location. Every signal the transmitter emitted contained implicit positional information, because signal strength is a function of distance. By tracking signal intensity over time from a fixed receiver position, a trained operator could reconstruct the fish's approximate movements, where it had been, where it was now, whether it was moving toward the harbor entrance or retreating toward deeper anchorage. A ship at anchor in a harbor is no immediate threat. The same ship underway and heading northwest is a different calculation entirely. If the Navy could determine that a specific vessel, a cruiser, a troop transport, a submarine tender, had left its anchorage and was proceeding toward a particular sector of the ocean, it could alert attack submarines already positioned along likely routes. It could redirect aircraft assets. It could warn the merchant convoys and the picket ships. The gap between knowing a departure was happening and not knowing it could be measured in hours, in course adjustments, in tonnage sunk or saved. The fish moved through the harbor as fish always move, not randomly, but according to the thermodynamic and chemical logic of the harbor environment. They were attracted toward the warm plumes radiating from vessel engine rooms. They sheltered under the shadows of piers and the hulls of anchored ships, where smaller fish gathered and the light was reduced. They drifted with tidal currents along the harbor floor and fed in the shallower margins near the dockside structures. None of these movements were strategically programmed. They were the movements of a creature that had evolved over geological time to exploit the microhabitat created by large, warm, slow-moving objects, which, in a natural harbor, meant rocks and reef formations, and in a military harbor, meant destroyers and tankers. This was the program's deepest irony. The fish was drawn to the ships by biological instinct. The Navy had not trained it to surveil its targets. Evolution had done that work already. The fish were following the same behavioral algorithms they had used before the first ship was ever built, seeking warmth, seeking cover, seeking the smaller organisms that accumulated in the ecological shadow of larger structures. The harbor's military infrastructure was, to a fish, simply an unusually dense cluster of large warm things. The fish moved toward them the way fish always had. The signal received by the offshore monitoring stations was a continuous wave carrier at a known frequency, a fingerprint unique to this transmitter, distinguishable from the various radio transmissions and electrical interference present in any busy military harbor. When the fish moved toward the harbor entrance or into the open water near departing vessels, the signal strengthened. When it retreated into the sheltered depths beneath a pier or into the shadow of a large hull, the signal faded. A skilled operator recording signal strength at regular intervals could produce a rough movement map, not precise, not directional, but sufficient to indicate whether the harbor's activity was increasing or decreasing. This was not wiretap intelligence. It was not the kind of operational specificity that would let a planner time an airstrike to the minute. It was something more diffuse, a continuous indicator of harbor activity, generated without human risk, without material that could be traced to American intelligence, and without a single asset that could be captured and interrogated. The fish operated for its full battery window. Then the signal stopped, either because the battery had exhausted itself, or because the fish had been caught in a net, or because it had simply swum beyond the receiver's detection range. The program's essential limitation was the same as the bat bombs, and the same as every biological intelligence operation before or since. You could not control the agent. You could only release it and listen. The fish program did not win the war. No single thing wins a war. Only the compounding of 1,000 smaller advantages, each one modest enough to be dismissed in isolation, together sufficient to shift the balance of events in ways that no single general or admiral could entirely see. What the fish program proved was something more abstract and, in the long run, more consequential. That living organisms, properly instrumented, could function as passive, self-powered, self-concealing sensors in environments that conventional technology could not safely penetrate. The fish did not need a support infrastructure. It did not need a controller running it through a dead drop. It did not need a cover story, because its cover story was biological, perfected by evolution across hundreds of millions of years of predator and prey, of the hunted and the hunter. It was, in the language that a later generation of defense planners would apply to exactly this concept, a persistent, low probability of detection sensor with near-zero logistical overhead. The limitations were real. You could not direct the fish to a specific anchorage. You could not compel it to maintain operationally useful positions or to surface at scheduled intervals for better signal propagation. You could not retrieve it, debrief it, or repair it if the transmitter developed a fault. Fish had an unfortunate tendency to end up in fishing nets, in the stomachs of larger predators, or simply dead on the harbor floor from causes that had nothing to do with the war. Battery technology in 1944 imposed hard limits on operational duration, and the program was too narrow, too dependent on biological unpredictability to be industrialized into a reliable, scalable intelligence platform. The Manhattan Project had the gravity of a singularity in the final years of the American war effort. Resources, attention, and the urgency of innovation flowed toward it and away from everything else. The bat bomb was canceled because it could not be ready by mid-1945. A dozen other unconventional programs, some brilliant, some insane, most floating somewhere in the uncertain country between, were quietly shelved as the atomic solution rendered them redundant. The fish radio was among them. Ideas of this kind do not die cleanly. They retreat into classified files and the private memories of officers who remember them decades after the papers are sealed. They surface again when the original problem recurs, and the problem of hidden harbor surveillance never stopped being a problem. In 1965, the U.S. Navy deployed a bottlenose dolphin named Tuffy to deliver tools and messages to a research module 200 feet underwater off the California coast. The marine mammal program had begun. By the 1980s, the Navy maintained over 100 trained dolphins and a contingent of trained sea lions, prepared for deployment in harbor defense, mine detection, and diver intercept operations. The animals were self-powered. They were acoustically inconspicuous in the harbor environment. They moved naturally through spaces that human divers and mechanical systems found dangerous and expensive to enter. They were, in every essential respect, the direct conceptual descendants of the fish program, biological assets doing intelligence work in environments that technology could not cheaply replicate. In 1973, the Navy began testing Project Combo, a system that concealed inter-ship communications inside recordings of pilot whale vocalizations. A submarine would broadcast whale song. A shore-based computer called the Combo Signal Recognizer would decode the messages. The ocean's own noise floor, the biological cacophony that marine fish had spent the war cataloging, was now being used as an encryption medium. And in the 21st century, DARPA committed $45 million across 5 research teams to a program called PALS, Persistent Aquatic Living Sensors. The concept: study how marine organisms respond behaviorally to the passage of underwater vehicles and use those behavioral changes as a distributed passive detection network. Goliath grouper, territorial fish that can reach 8 feet in length and 800 pounds, produce distinct low-frequency acoustic pulses when they detect intruders. Those pulses carry through water. They can be detected by hydrophones positioned at distances that make the sensor functionally invisible to the intruder. The grouper do not know they are working for the Navy. Neither did the fish in 1944. There is a long tradition in intelligence history of describing the most consequential innovations as accidents, things that happened because desperate people tried things that seemed impossible, and one of them worked. The Trout memo described enemy deception as fly fishing, and a British officer took the metaphor to its logical end and put a briefcase on a dead man. A dentist wrote to the president about bats, and the Navy spent $2 million turning that letter into a weapon that burned its own airfield. Someone, in 1944, looked at the unsolvable problem of harbor surveillance and thought, what if the sensor was already in the harbor? What if it always had been? These were not accidents. They were the products of a particular intellectual posture, a willingness to follow an idea to its endpoint without flinching when that endpoint turned out to be strange. The Second World War did not invent this posture. It created the conditions under which it became acceptable to say out loud what had previously seemed too absurd to propose. The fish worked because fish are already in the harbor. They have always been in the harbor. They were there before the first dock was built, before the first ship was dragged up the beach, before anyone decided this particular body of water was strategically significant. They require no insertion operation, no extraction plan, no secure communication channel. They do not defect. They do not grow disillusioned with the cause. They do not, under any form of interrogation yet devised, disclose what they have seen. They go where the water takes them, and they broadcast their position to anyone with the right receiver. 80 years later, the ocean is not a more transparent place. It is noisier, more contested, and more comprehensively monitored than at any point in human history. Nuclear submarines transit it. Unmanned underwater vehicles map its floor in systematic passes. Hydrophone arrays planted in the seabed by a dozen different navies listen for acoustic signatures whose classification levels are not available to the public. And somewhere in that acoustic murk, the intellectual descendants of a program that implanted a radio inside a fish in 1944 continue to operate, in forms that DARPA will partially describe in press releases, and in forms that it will not describe at all. The fish did not know it was a spy. That was and remains the point. The most effective surveillance asset is the one the enemy cannot imagine, not because it is hardened or encrypted or hardened against detection, but because it looks exactly like something that has always been there. The ocean has always been full of things that watch. In 1944, the Navy figured out how to be one of them. When you look at the ocean, think about what might be looking back, and whether you would know it if you saw it. If you know of other classified programs where militaries turned biology into intelligence, share them in the comments below. And if you found this story as strange and as fascinating as we did, consider sharing it with someone who needs to be reminded that the most extraordinary chapters of the Second World War are still being discovered.